My name is Katy Jayasuriya and I'm a PhD student at the University of Sheffield. Today I'm presenting my paper titled Reframing Guenevere, Uncovering an Alternative Narrative in the Cut Materials of Camelot. I'm currently working on a critical edition of the Lerner and Loewe 1960 Broadway musical Camelot, and during my research I've been able to explore the cut and revised materials of the musical. I've found that during its tryout period, the narrative direction of the musical changed significantly, and this had a huge impact on the role of Guenevere and the depiction of the love affair. This part of the story forms a chapter in my thesis where I suggest that Lerner's first script was a much more closer interpretation of T.H. White's book, The Once and Future King, and was therefore a more unconventional take on Arthurian legend, particularly in relation to its representations of gender and sexuality. Today's paper will provide a snapshot of this work by demonstrating how the rehearsal script and earlier music scores were more sympathetic toward Guenevere and the love affair. This will be shown via an analysis of three interwoven themes. The first is the character development of Guenevere, the second is the role of the knights in Camelot's destruction, and the third is the nature of the relationship between Arthur, Guenevere and Lancelot. But to begin with, I'd like to paint a bit of a picture of the musical's tryout period so that we can understand why it was changed so significantly. Camelot was a highly ambitious work. Based on The Once and Future King, the first rehearsal script had attempted to translate a lot of what was in the book onto the stage. When the company began their rehearsals in September 1960, they were grappling with magic, quests, an animal ballet, jousts, philosophical musings, political discussions, and so on. On this slide we can see some sketches from the rehearsals. On the bottom left is director Moss Hart with Robert Goulet, who played Lancelot, and Julie Andrews, who played Guinevere, and Richard Burton, who played King Arthur. Then in the middle we can see the choreography of the jousts taking place, and on the right we can see Horrid the dog enjoying a tea break with Julie Andrews and Robert Coote, who played Pellinore. On the opening night of its tryout period in Toronto, Moss Hart took to the stage before the curtains opened. He said, "Camelot is lovely. Camelot is going to be glorious. Camelot is long. You're going to be a lot older when you get out of here tonight." The curtain came down at 12:20 a.m. and the musical had run for over 3.5 hours. It was clear to the audience, to the critics and to the writers that changes would need to be made in order to get the show ready for Broadway. Over the next few weeks, substantial cuts were made, but it still wasn't quite right, and by the time it closed in Toronto, there were rumours that it might not make it to Broadway at all. It was crisis time. And so Lerner began to significantly rework the material. In his autobiography, he describes how he spent 3 or 4 days discussing every conceivable drastic change before he discovered what had motivated him in the first place. And that was, quote, "the end of the journey when Arthur has lost his love, his friend, and his round table and believes his life has been a failure. Then a small boy appears from behind a tent who doesn't know the round table is dead and who wishes to become a knight. Arthur realises that as long as his vision is alive in one small heart, he has not failed. Men die, but an idea does not. To me," he writes, "that scene was the play, and somehow the steps had to be shortened so the journey could be made." In this reasoning, he found a new narrative force around which to order cuts and revisions in the hope that Camelot would work better. But shortening the steps had a drastic impact on the narrative direction of the musical. Lerner cut all the material that fell outside of the love affair narrative. This meant cutting much of the magical elements of the musical, most of the dialogue pertaining to the creation of the chivalrous code and Arthur's civil law, and crucially, the role of the knights in Camelot's destruction. Furthermore, Guinevere's character development and the integrity of the love between the three characters suffered. The next section of this paper will focus on some of these cuts so as to demonstrate to what extent the essence of the musical was changed, beginning with the representation of Guinevere. Guinevere's introductory song, "The Simple Joys of Maidenhood," depicts her as a young and immature woman who is seeking what Leah Hort has described as a medieval form of adventure. This contrasts with her final song, "I Loved You Once in Silence," which, as Lerner describes, is more sophisticated, more harmonically complex, the lyric a sad reflection of a woman whom guilt and grief has aged. Whilst this does show a linear character progression, in the earlier version of Camelot, Guinevere was depicted as a more three-dimensional character who demonstrated a sense of self-awareness and therefore agency within her predestined narrative. This was done by repeating motifs from her introductory song at significant moments of the plot. The first time this happens is a few scenes after Guinevere and Lancelot have realised their love for each other. He has been away on the quests, which is a cut song that I'll discuss later, and she is getting ready for his return. Her ladies are talking excitedly about the celebrations that will be taking place that evening, but throughout this talk, Guinevere remains silent. This contrasts with the character she was during the first performance of Simple Joys, when she sings of those adoring, daring boys and indulges in the dream of knights pining after her. Here, soon to be confronted by Lancelot, Guinevere is aware that her dream has come true, and yet her silence as he rides towards the castle is suggestive of a pensiveness that her previous self was not capable of. When the ladies leave, as written in the stage directions, Guinevere sits on a bench, clasps her hands and looks up. She then begins to sing, Saint Genevieve, Saint Genevieve. She is praying to her patron saint just as she did in the very first scene in her very first song. No more lyrics are written, but at the end of the otherwise blank page, the stage directions read, Guinevere is on the bench at the conclusion of the song. The earlier drafts of the orchestral score suggest that this number was a variation of Simple Joys, although it is not clear what the lyrics might have been or how much of it was reprised. The second reprise happens in Act 2, Scene 7 of the rehearsal script. Arthur has been trapped in the forest by Morgan Le Fay's invisible wall, and so Lancelot takes the opportunity to visit Guinevere in her bedchamber. Lancelot tells her that he is miserable. He says, I grow more and more ashamed before my soul, and Guinevere asks him, why are you unhappy when we have a moment together? To which Lancelot responds, because we are together, don't you understand? This question leads to Guinevere's second reprisal of Simple Joys. She sings, where are the simple joys of maidenhood, when the world was so easily understood? Good was good, bad was bad for me, and joy was never sad for me. But here you are unhappy that you came, and had you not, you still would feel the same. In this scene, the reprise acted as an indication of Guinevere's character development. This is done in multiple ways. Firstly, the lyrics are reflective and show Guinevere as looking back at her younger self when things were more easily understood. She recognises the irony of her current position. She's found the supposed joy she had yearned for, but she's now sad, and Lancelot is unhappy. In this recognition, she has demonstrated self-awareness. She is no longer simply a medieval caricature bound by her own historiographic narrative, but instead is a developed, complex, three-dimensional character. Secondly, there are some differences in scoring that reflect this development. Guinevere's first performance of Simple Joys is in C major and played con motto, whereas the reprise is in B major and played moderato. The slowing of pace and slightly lower register is indicative of the older, more matured Guinevere. The 4-bar introduction to the reprise is a variation of the melodic line, where are the simple joys, harmless convivial joys, heard in the first performance. A transcription of both moments, taken from Loewe's piano vocal scores, demonstrates the key differences. Here is the motif heard in the first version. And here it is heard in the second reprise. Leah Hort argues that Arthur's ambitions show that a break with the past is an important part of Arthur's future greatness. In creating his chivalric code, he becomes a visionary shaping the future, rather than a static figure of the past. She then notes that in contrast, Guinevere is linked to a specific set of medieval conventions that appear increasingly trivial and antiquated after the founding of the Round Table, as evidenced by the lusty month of May specifically. But as the earlier script and scores demonstrate, this was not always the case. The repeated motif shows how Guenevere was able to develop alongside her husband, and that her growing agency and knowingness helps her to break from her past and the constraints that bind her there. In contrast, the knights remain firmly ensconced by their medieval boundaries. They are static figures of the past and unable to move forward with Arthur and Guenevere. This is demonstrated by 3 songs that were all eventually cut, but told of the inevitability of their rebellion. The first song to discuss is called The Quests. This was a montage of 4 choreographed sequences that depicted Lancelot's quests around the country, righting all the wrongdoing. On his quests, he met with several knights who were up to no good. He fought them and won, sending them back to Camelot singing "We Have Changed." The wrongdoing, although undoubtedly written with a comedic tone, was quite bad. One knight had a hobby of kidnapping men, who he would then tie up in his cellar and, quote, beat like dogs. Another knight thought his wife might be having an affair, so he locked her in a cage and attempted to starve her to death. This little extract is taken from the sequence which depicts the Orkney brothers as they contemplate terrorising a village. Gareth sings, "Look ye lads, that peaceful village in the valley there below, what a bonny place to pillage and create some bonny woe. We'll go plundering all together and we'll have a bloody spree, then we'll plant some bonny heather where the village used to be." Lancelot stops all of these awful things happening, but it is clear that these knights were written as barbaric, and the idea was that the Round Table would turn them towards a more chivalrous style of life, but it would only be by force. The next cut song is "Fie on Goodness," which you may have heard because it is still present on the cast album and does feature in some productions of the musical. But Hart and Lerner actually cut it from the show 3 months into the initial Broadway run. In "Fie on Goodness," Mordred has just arrived to the court and wants to stir up some trouble. He asks the knights how they're handling their new virtuous life. They then explode into the chorus. They sing, "Fie on goodness, fie, lechery and vice have been arrested. Not a maiden is evermore in threat. Virgins can wander unmolested. Lolly-lo let, gad it's a sweat. Oh, fie on goodness, fie." The song reveals that their barbaric and unchivalrous tendencies have only been temporarily quelled, and that really, if it was not for the threat of Lancelot, they would still be up to their old ways. And finally, when Lancelot has been removed from the court and war has been announced, Lerner makes it clear that whilst Guenevere, Arthur and Lancelot came to a tragic ending, at least the knights got there happily ever after. In the earlier script, before Arthur, Guenevere and Lancelot meet for the last time on the battlefields, 2 soldiers appear from the darkness, singing a reprise of the earlier song, Guenevere. They sing, "Guenevere, Guenevere, life is strange, life is queer. Who'd have reckoned we'd be here fighting lance for Guenevere? Who said all war's a hell? I have never felt so well." The effect of this moment is significant. The insatiable desire for war and unrest that the knights have demonstrated throughout the musical has finally beaten Arthur's vision for the future. By making this theme such a large part of the narrative, some of the blame has been lifted from Guinevere's shoulders. The dynamic has shifted. Guinevere is represented as a flawed human being, but one who does try to atone for her sin of loving 2 men. Whereas, whilst the knights are also flawed, they happily and gladly give in to their violent urges, no matter the cost to society. And this really is the essence, I think, of The Once and Future King, in which T.H. White writes, "If people reach perfection, they vanish." Our power is in how we learn from our imperfections and respond to them in a way that allows us to progress and better ourselves. In Lerner's rehearsal script, Guinevere was forward-thinking enough to be able to do that, but the knights were not, and it is their inability to do this that ultimately destroys the Round Table. Another crucial part of this alternative narrative is the way that Lerner represented the dynamic of the 3 characters on stage after Arthur had acknowledged the affair in his proposition speech. In the rehearsal script, there is a scene that depicts Arthur, Guinevere and Lancelot sharing a pleasant evening together stargazing. The effect of this scene is to show how they had accepted their unconventional setup and how it worked on practical terms. Sadly, I don't have a picture of this moment, so instead I've used this picture, which is from the rehearsal script read-through, and you can see our three main characters here right in the centre. So the scene occurs a few weeks after the arrival of Mordred, and they're standing on the terrace looking at the stars. It begins with a trivial conversation, but when Arthur fails to answer a question put to him, Lancelot asks him what is wrong. It's at this point that Arthur tells Guinevere and Lancelot that he is Mordred's father. He goes into detail about his night with Mordred's mother and shares the guilt he feels about it. Lancelot acts with indignation that Mordred should now be behaving in such a hostile way and proves his allegiance to Arthur by promising him that he shall not harm his heir apparent. Guinevere responds with sympathy. She says, "I feel nothing about it, and less about him, and neither should you. What you did was done to you when you were too young to know better." In acceptance of Arthur's wrongdoing, an equilibrium is formed within the trio. None are perfect, but they support each other in that knowledge. After this discussion, Lance tells Arthur that he shall read the Charter for Civil Law and provide feedback the next morning. He then thanks Guinevere for dinner and says goodnight. The interweaving of domesticity and work highlights their balanced relationship. An empathetic light has been shone on the love triangle. Whilst it was unconventional and undermined heteronormative marital convention, it appeared to work for those involved. Amanda Serrano states that after reading The Once and Future King, it becomes increasingly difficult to categorise Guinevere as the unfaithful wife, and that is also true of Lerner's original interpretation. So why is this important? Representations of Guinevere have always been imbued with contextual beliefs surrounding womanhood. In the 19th century, her imagery was used as a cautionary warning for unconfined sexuality. She failed her duty as a wife, and as a result, society crumbled. T.H. White's approach to the legend went some way to exonerating Guinevere from the role of the fallen woman, and it has been argued by some scholars that his interpretation provided an impetus for the rise in feminist readings that occurred in the latter half of the 20th century. Lerner's first draft script of Camelot more closely reflects White's retelling and this characterisation. In Maya Cantu's book American Cinderellas on the Broadway musical stage, she discusses the popularity of the Cinderella story in the 1950s. She writes that, quote, "Traditionally, female figures requiring salvation or redemption, respectively, both the princess and the prostitute, can be interpreted as stemming from Cold War anxieties about the containment of female sexuality and the threat of sexual chaos from women." And so we might say that in the final version of Camelot, Guinevere better reflects her status as a cautionary warning and better reflects the prominent ideologies of womanhood during the 1950s. She has reverted back to being the cause of destruction. I have been transcribing the cut music from Camelot for the appendices of my critical edition. But by analysing this material and its relationship to The Once and Future King, as well as contextual issues surrounding the production, I can't help but wonder whether it might be time to return to Lerner's initial retelling of the legend. Here is a list of the sources that I've used throughout this paper. If you would like some more detail or some more information, please feel free to contact me here. And thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have during the panel discussion. Thank you.